Why don't you guys just introduce yourself and tell a little bit more about your projects, what you are doing?
Would you like me to go? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yes. Skinner, you could go on.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I guess I would like to start just by talking about why I'm interested in this particular subject matter. I've spent my life in the sort of combination of politics, entrepreneurship, and education. And I mean, I think that the problems that we face in many corners of the world, not limited to what's going on in Belarus right now, but I think that it's a more fundamental problem. These are rooted in a lot of our basic assumptions about the way that life and the world should be organized, and we keep running into walls about it. And so I've been trying for a number of years to find new angles of attack through education and through entrepreneurship. And I think that this year's pandemic has sort of offered an opportunity for people to radically rethink the way that we're approaching these problems. And I decided also myself to engage in a bit of a radical rethink of my own approach to how I'm engaging with them. So part of my involvement in today's conference is really just geared toward listening to what the other panelists and the audience participants are saying, because I'm taking notes myself. I'm trying to figure out where can we all go from here, and how can we do so in a peaceful and peaceable manner. So that's why I'm here and what I'm interested in.
Hey, so my name is Chavi Vivес. I'm the co-founder of Vocdoni. And Vocdoni is a project that is trying to build a completely decentralized voting system that uses blockchain and zero knowledge technology to do so. And the project started because of the censorship that Catalonia received in 2017. That date, there was a referendum, and the force and censorship was used in many different ways to prevent people from voting, from like physical but also digital. And that was the trigger for Vocdoni to start. Vocdoni in Esperanto means to give voice, and that's the aim of the project. We want to create a completely decentralized, censorship-resistant voting system that, you know, allowed anyone to express themselves, even like if nation-level attacks are on the way. So since then, it's been 3 years already that we've been working on developing this technology. That you know, before that we spent like a year trying to see what was out there to solve this problem, and we realized that was unsolved problem. Like this fundamental primitive of voting is still not fully solved. So we took ourselves with the mission to solve that. And for the most part, what we're trying to do right now is just create a voting system that's censorship resistant and can be used from a smartphone. And so that's what brings me here. I think there's a lot of similarities with what we lived in Catalonia and what Belarus is living now. And you know, being part of this conversation is very exciting for us.
Thank you, Xavi. I'm Дэвид Boville from London. Good to meet you as well, Skinner, and everyone else here. Yeah, so my background, being here in the UK, I really started a long time ago being very frustrated with the democratic system, strangely enough. I just felt that I had no clear way to speak about what I wanted to speak about, and my vote didn't count. And I was a kind of a student, a medical student, and I was very, very frustrated with it, particularly how the dialogue and how politics was being discussed. Just a sense of frustration. And I started a project in medical school in which medical students were collaborating, sharing their notes and writing notes together. And this was in late 1980s, early 1990s. And that project evolved because the main critique of that, because obviously it was before Wikipedia and what have you, was what's the quality of the knowledge here? These are just students doing this. And so I started to get students to kind of vote for and the propositions and debate and argue and put some social editorial in there. And that project slowly emerged into basically, I left medical school and I started to work with performance and how people came together in discussion in an interactive space. And most of the funding for that came from art. And again, it was how do you get people to come and talk and interact in unusual ways? And all the time I was working with technology, really dissatisfied with the voting and democratic system. And that led me to join up with some international democratic movements and create or co-create with a couple of other people some thing we called liquid democracy. And I developed some coding systems in that and some voting systems, early cryptographic systems. But my main dissatisfaction for that was it lost the human side. So really, it's this interface between groups and human beings and group discussion and group-to-group discussion and the huge potential for that and all the things we could and can and are building and the enormous distance from the kind of medieval democratic systems that we have out there in society that are causing so much damage and so much problem. And that's kind of what brought me to this space. We're missing Santiago because of a time issue. I think he's talking at 2 o'clock today, which is a shame because liquid democracy and many of the things that we're all working on are really at the core of Democracy Earth, that project, which is, I'd love to enter into the discussion. But what I thought we could do to open up the discussion a bit and to sort of go around is maybe split this talk because it was just really nice to, in the spirit of democracy, to make this more kind of Socratic, to kind of maybe ask you guys a couple of questions. One really about what your main frustration, what you think the main problem is with the current democratic systems that are out there, what really drives you forwards? And then a second one is what you think the main things we can do and work together to fix it. If we start at the beginning, maybe with you, Skinner, what really would you identify as the big glaring, there are many things that have been identified as a problem with, and they're very different across cultures. So what's affecting people here in Belarus or in Minsk is very different from people in Latin America and from America and what have you. But in some ways, maybe they have something in common as well. What would you identify as the main frustration or problem that you would like to fix with democracy?
I think where I prefer to start in the matter is actually in the fundamental question that I think is true wherever you might be. And that's whether government has arrived at consent through peaceful means or through violent means. I think that there's a bit of a confusion about the notion of consent. You know, the Jefferson quote that all legitimate government derives from the consent of the governed. It requires a bit of a deeper examination because I think that consent can be enforced and manufactured through a variety of ways. Xavi was talking about censorship. Censorship is one of the ways that consent is artificially manufactured by suppressing certain forms of information. It's a form of soft violence, but it's not a peaceable means of arriving at consent. And then, of course, you know, we see in many parts of the world and increasingly in other parts that we didn't see it, consent being manufactured at gunpoint, because, you know, a person who walks away from somebody pointing a gun at them is giving their consent to the gun, in a sense. They're saying, okay, your authority is real and I recognize it, which is a rather reasonable thing to do if somebody is pointing a gun in your face. And so I think that in order to get to the question of what constitutes a functional democracy, we have to look at how can we arrive at consent through peaceful means, and how do we make sure that we don't let subtle forms of soft violence infiltrate this mechanism of arriving at consent. And so I think all of the things that I will be wanting to talk about later when we talk about the mechanisms that could be implemented or the specific changes that could be made to democracy, they all come back to, have we really arrived at consent, and have we arrived at it peacefully? Because if we don't, then we can be sure that whatever system is implemented, if it's not really through voluntary consent, it will eventually collapse under the pressure of interest, just as our current systems have. So I think one of the metaphors that I like to use to reframe the debate is, rather than to think about democracy or forms of government as some pre-programmed ideal, it will have all of this quality or that quality, it's better to look at it as an adaptive, that government is an adaptive response mechanism to bad actors in society, the way that the immune system keeps out pathogens from infecting the body. And so as technology evolves, time goes on, we can't stay in some platonic state of perfected democracy. It's impossible. So instead, we have to build adaptive systems that are responding to the changing strategies of bad actors. And that's how we can eventually get at stable consent, I think.
And you're talking to the converted here as an immunologist, and also in the context of Belarus, I think is it 26 years now? Any case, Savi, if you were to pick one thing that really troubles you about the current state of democracy, what would you consider the most important deficiency there?
I would say that it's actually the presupposition that voting in and of itself establishes consent. I think that's actually at the foundation of the problem. And I think that that's what we see in the opposition to democracy that's rising in other parts of Eastern Europe, and also in my original homeland in the United States. It's because people are saying, I don't believe that this government has my consent. It does not represent me. And saying, well, you had a chance to vote doesn't seem like an adequate response, because if there's tension and violence mounting in the streets, they're not buying the response.
Yeah, thank you. And let's maybe turn to Savi and get your input to this.
Yeah, I think following up with Skinner, for me personally, this frustration, it's the disconnect that there is between people and what the governance is. Like, there is a complete disconnect and sense of belonging that the politicians and the people in the positions of power are caring for us. And I think it has a lot to do with the voting is just like the final step for like formalizing consent, but there is like a process before that, which is chaotic by default, which is governance is chaotic. It's like the human nature, which is, understanding everyone's needs and putting them together like in a way that everyone can have their needs satisfied. This is chaotic. So what we did is we formalized it in a way. We added bureaucracy, we added roles, we added a lot of systems that over time have put it further and further away from like the decision-making process. And now we found like a society that is extremely frustrated with the leadership and with the governance, because they have no ways to be part of it. They don't have no ways to belong in this system. And for that, I will add that the same reasons that brought us to this point, which I think they're mainly problems that had to do with the technology. It's really hard to coordinate society. Like, it's a coordination problem. The same reason that we got to that point, the same tools can now like change that, right? And we have new technologies that have enabled like new forms of governance, new forms of decision making.
Thank you. I'm just trying to grab an image. You're both inspiring me to show a photograph here. I'm flashing on and off, sorry about that. Just out of it, these images here, these photographs here, if you have a look at them, let's see if you can imagine what those are. So we have this here. This is Teresa, actually. And this one here. This is my mum. Okay. Have you any idea what those crosses represent? These are all the votes she's expected to have in the rest of her life. That's the entire communication channel that she has to express everything she knows about her life, her political preferences, her desires, her wisdom and her knowledge. And even for young people, here, this is Maya when she was 16. So this is a project, an art project we did called Not Enough, saying that this medieval idea of putting these tokens in a box once every 4 years or so, even if you have the right and the unfettered ability to do that, is simply such a contrast from here we are in Zoom with millions of bits of pixels going backwards and forwards, and it's not even that as rich as in real life. And this is the data bandwidth, you know, that's about 2 bytes a decade or something like that, passing backward and forwards between the citizens and what have you. And we have so much more capability. People are used now to using or different forms of media. I mean, and our democratic systems were invented when we were basically still in the Stone Age, and haven't changed since then very much.
Yeah, I would observe that we have an almost infinite way of expressing our preferences when it comes to something like food or clothing or the superficial details of life. There's an infinite array of preference expressions available to the average person almost now anywhere in the world. And so we're flooded and bombarded with variety of choice that differs greatly in detail in everything except in the way that we collectively organize ourselves. And this is troubling, considering that the consequences of not being able to order a meal that exactly fits your preferences are quite low, and yet we managed to do that rather effectively. And yet when it comes to whether or not we deprive somebody of their life or their liberty, these questions have almost no variety of response, only binary response. And of course, at a certain level, when people realize that those binary choices don't even necessarily represent a real choice between one and the other, it's quite expected that we would find ourselves in a position where people say, well, maybe this is just not so much the way to go about it. And even if they are not necessarily instantly willing to say, let's go with an autocrat, autocracy is sort of the default backup. If you don't believe in democracy, well, what's left? You know, various forms of autocracy.
So my pet sort of, I think I share the frustrations we talked about, but I would say if I was to choose something a bit different there, my pet sort of grievance with the current and what looks to be, unless we do something about it, the future kind of democratic systems we have, is this inability, this ossification of the system and the inability for it to evolve and change. So if you look at, like, I haven't got a graph here, but if you look at a kind of a graph of the change and the amount of innovation that's happened, let's say in food distributions or science or technology, it's a classic kind of exponential graph. You can look at it in terms of patents, you can look at it in terms of almost any measure, and it's dramatically increasing year by year from the Middle Ages to now. But if you look at the evolution in our governance, if you look at the number of new legal forms or the number of new ways of voting or the ways of representing us or the ways in which our say gets filtered through into actual policy and action, this is almost a flat line. There's a couple of tiny little bleeps. And that means that there becomes an increasing tension, this huge distance between the world around us and the speed of change and the technical possibilities and the governance systems that we operate by. And that the fact that there is no incentive for anyone to change the rules of the game, if you do that, you get basically killed by everyone. If you're a political party and you try and change the rules of the game, you get nothing. You only win by being better at the rules of the existing game. There is no one investing in or paying you in research, in academia, in economics, in politics, to look at alternative political systems. There's no comparative economics or experimental law. There's no one really, we're beginning to do it now, and really it's come in the fringes. It's come out a lot of innovation in blockchain space, where people and hackers are experimenting with alternative possible futures in that space. But otherwise, we're stuck in 100-year-old political debates between theories that were kind of invented before we even knew that there was such a thing called evolution. And so it's this distance and the slow speed of innovation, which is my main thing. So anything that allows us to really test out new governance mechanisms, find out what works, explore the potential space of governance, rather than say, I've got the best voting system, I've got the best whatever it is what I would say is my main concern with the present system.
There is this well-known quote from Buckminster Fuller that I think is very representative to what you're expressing. It says something like, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly the problem that we have with governance in general and political systems. And that's the reason why the blockchain space is evolving so fast. It's just playing in a different, it's in a different paradigm. It's like complete film. It's like the Wild West there. And that allows for innovation. So how can we merge these two worlds?
Okay, so let's move on to the second, maybe not describing the kind of shite description of the current state of the world, but let's look at both. I think there was a request to shout out earlier not to be too kind of idealistic or too dreamy about theory, but let's look at concrete things that we've got to build with, actions that people are actively taking. And let's look at, if you were to look at, let's say, the situation in Belarus in terms of their political situation, if you were to compare it, because we all have an international perspective here with what's happening in other parts of the world, whether it be Europe, America, South America, China, right? What do you think are the most important things to build, to make, and that we can change, right? So maybe let's reverse the order and start with you, Xavi, again this time.
For me, I'm just following up to the quote I mentioned, like it comes down to people, right? The democracy means empowering the people. So instead of focusing on like high level structures, for me it's about how can we give tools for the people, like normal people, everyone, you and me, to change the current reality. And I think now this translates to like mostly technological tools or coordination tools. So from voting to messaging to new forms of organizations, this is how like, can we rebuild this society? Because from the top down, I see like very, like we can't experiment, as you were mentioning, like there is not enough room to test for trial and error.
So I definitely want to come back to you and ask you some detailed questions about what you're working on with Vocdoni, what your main challenges are at the moment. But let's ask the same question to you, Skynner. What's the key things that you think are important to build and make that can change the situation we described?
I think the fundamental part of it is as Xavi is mentioning, it's a cultural problem of getting people in to actually be properly involved. And I don't think that the primary problem is actually that people are being excluded. I think the primary problem is that people are not including themselves. And I don't think we should be too surprised by that. Erich Fromm, the German psychologist who wrote about the mass psychology of Germany prior to the war, the book was entitled The Escape from Freedom. And his argument is, of course, that people don't really want to be free in the sense of that freedom comes with lots of responsibility. And so I think that there's the first most fundamental problem to solve is helping more and more people come into a sense of self-reliance and personal responsibility for their situation as a citizen, and not expecting somebody else to do that for them. I think that can be done through kind of a staging forms of participation that might eventually include a formal role, or the augmentation of formal institutions. But I think in line with
a bit more graphic detail, how would you picture that process for people in the audience? And bear in mind that quite a lot of people English as well here is going to add an extra barrier to, and I can't quite picture what you're saying. Well, I can guess, but I would love to picture it more in a way that makes it easier for us to tear apart and discuss.
So let's take our current primary mode of parliamentary representation. In most democratic countries, you have either a unicameral or bicameral legislative branch that has some kind of divided power with an executive branch. In the case of Belarus and the United States, this is supposedly to be quite a separation of executive versus legislative power. In parliamentary systems, like in Western Europe, those powers are a bit more overlapping. But in either case, we have some period of time that we elect our legislators to go serve, and then they come back and we vote on them again in some number of years. But when we vote on them again, we are not given, we have only the choice between the person holding the office or the party holding the office and the other party or one of the other parties. And so I think that starting from there, this is what creates a lot of the tribalism, because we can't just render a yes or no verdict on our elected representative. Like, this person represented me or did not represent me. No, now I have to choose. Well, is this guy really better than that one? And then weigh the two against each other. So one of my concrete suggestions is actually the creation of what would look like the corporate equivalent of a supervisory board, a board of a constituent assembly that is elected to, on an ongoing basis, review and audit and report back to the constituents on the performance of the member of the legislature. And so that could be organized now. You could hold citizen elections with the state not involved whatsoever, and do all of this as performance art, if nothing else, at the beginning. But I imagine that if it were done well and actually started to yield some results, you could imagine constitutional evolution in a way where, instead of presenting the legislator to the electorate against the other candidates, incumbents are first given some sort of trial and review of the last term of their tenure, and some or mid tenure revocation of that. And I think that even on specific law, the idea that on specific laws, rather than thinking of democracy only in the affirmative, we want to vote for something. We want to take these. Everybody casts a vote, and then we know how we decided. I also think that we can implement systems where people can remove their consent for specific laws on an ongoing basis. And if it falls below a certain threshold, then the law is no longer enforceable. And I think these are ways that we can balance, because I don't think there's a clear-cut solution. I think it's about pushing from this side, pushing from that side, and trying to rein in the abuse of discretion that our elected officials are able to take with impunity.
And Savi, in terms of your take on what would be the most important, the problems and the opportunities to basically build a better future, are they purely technical? Because you're clearly working from your point of view, and filling a hole in what is needed in terms of a technical system that works on mobile and is censorship resistant. But what challenges do you have for that? What help do you need for that? And do you feel that that's enough by itself?
Definitely not. And following what Skinner was mentioning before, I think there is a cultural problem where people do not embody the responsibility necessary to be like a proper citizen, let's say. We end up ourselves delegating our responsibilities to, every time more and more politicians, medics, banks, and so on, right? So we so we really don't want to be free, right? Like we are comfortable giving away our freedom because we gain comfort, and that has become the societal rule. Like that's how we live now. So when there is like pressure, even in cases like Belarus or like Catalonia, people are triggered, are willing to make change when they really touching like their fundamental needs. But for the most part, like if I can live my life, if I can, have my PlayStation, if I can have food, if I can, hang out with friends, well, these needs are not attacked. For the most part, a lot of people is just fine. So they don't take action for like the life of the governance, right? So we, just by putting technological tools, we can facilitate, we can engage, but that's just one other tool. And technological tools, I believe at that moment are definitely necessary, because there's definitely like constraints, like democracy, it's tight, it's constrained because of the tools we have right now. But that doesn't go alone. Like we need a change in conscience. We need a change in like how we relate to our peers and to our society.
So if I maybe try and add something here, like partly my perspective, and maybe throw out a challenge to you guys as well, maybe make it a bit more confrontational, a bit more, I don't know, it's a bit dull if we're all agreeing, isn't it? Which is, I think there's something very hopeful out there that we haven't maybe touched on as a lever that we can use, and also something which is deeply disturbing about the potential of using technology, of using blockchain and using mobile, that we haven't touched on. So I believe that by putting these two things together, we might be able to address things in a synergistic, positive way, while they can equally go in a very dystopian way. So first of all, to say what I think is really disturbing, or potentially can make the matter even worse, or preserve the problem, is this distance there are between the elite knowledgeable in medieval current political systems. These would be the politicians and the lawyers and the bankers, who have had many years of training and education and cultural knowledge in either the financial system or the legal system, or learning how the levers of government work, and the ordinary citizen. That gap was huge. But we're in very big danger of doing exactly the same with algorithms, with blockchain, and with technical solutions. So my main sort of thing that I want to tackle is, how can you get human beings to get more actively involved in the design of our future systems, right, of the algorithms and of the code? And I think lots of people are sort of interested in that, but I don't see a lot of progress along that line, and I think we can do a lot better. And on the positive side, I think one of the things that really inspires me, that I get really hopeful, is the use of art, and particularly the use of things like long form and podcasting. There is an explosion in really, not Twitter, not Facebook, social media, but thoughtful, long form deliberation that many people are listening to. And my belief is that we can create a new form of kind of democratic theatre, an experience that you can go to that is really exciting. You get the hackles on the back of your neck go up. You can use documentary to get involved in the subject, really emotionally involved in it. You can debate with your neighbours like you might do down the pub, but not in circular, stale, aggressive arguments, but because of the rules of the theatre, in more playful, progressive, creative, game-like exploration of decisions. And then, yeah, you can maybe go back home and vote, or you can vote in the group space. But it's bringing to life, in the old Greek sense of theatre, and marrying that with technology, with podcasting, with VJs, with graphic representation of the information and voting, being able to explore that space, really creating a much more visual, because a lot of this blockchain democratic space is very text, very nerdy, very minimal interface. So how we use video, how we use these Zoom conferences, like it would be really nice if we had little audience feedback things coming in here, if we can explore data landscapes, examine them, debate them. If there were rules like, I'm talking too long now, my airtime is, I'm running out of airtime, we should cut now to Skinner or Xavi or someone from the audience. How we bring the deliberation to life, I think we can make that exciting. And when we bring people into that conversation, we can use that to co-design the systems. So we can use that in a kind of citizen jury-like deliberative assembly to give the specification of the kind of voting systems, the governance systems, the financial systems that we want to build. And then we can bring in the technological people to help build that. But at the moment, we're in danger of the technologists dreaming up systems from a very skewed perspective, from a perspective of diversity of the sort of people who are these technologists, and embedding in their cultural preferences and their political preferences and their financial preferences into these systems without minimal participation of the wider community. So that to me is both a danger, let's say a danger to you, Xavi, if you're working on a mobile phone and you're working on the blockchain, and also an opportunity. And I'm wondering how, you know, you've got hundreds of thousands of people going out onto the streets of Belarus. You've got, and I would love to work with people to make things. And I feel frustrated all the time that that process of working with people to make things is segmented into this startup over here, this project over there, and the audience or the consumers or whatever we call them, the citizens over there. And the gluing together of this is not as productive, not as efficient, and I see no reason for that. I would like to do a follow-on from this conference where we do agile workshops, where we do design workshops, where we bring coders on board, and I would like to do that every week and then do a review of that. I would like to release that as a podcast and bring people in and not do that as pure talk, but be delivering real software, mobile apps and code through that process. So that's my rant and my provocation to you. And please throw back or add to it, or I'll leave the floor to you for now, because I think
I'll say that we're actually planning for a hackathon for redesigning all this, like for early next year. So we'll love to join efforts here to see like how we can shape it. But
tell us more about Vocdoni and how people could participate in that hackathon. What would you want from people to join? Is it just coders you need? Who do you need in the hackathon?
So let me step back a little bit, because I think it's important to see how we understand voting. So we all have like a very concrete idea of what voting is, which is, you know, this day that you go and you put the paper every 4 years. But we understand voting as a signaling mechanism that has cryptographic guarantees. So for us, voting is like a formalization of a collective signaling. And that can be translated to many things. But the problem we have right now I believe, like the technical problem we have is like this system does not exist. So we can invent, we can imagine, because we're limited to like the final formalization of this experience of governance, of consensus, of discussion. So we're understanding voting as a protocol, as something that just deliver cryptographically proof of one's expression. And with that in a base as infrastructure for the commons, we can now experiment, we can build, we can imagine anything we want. So having this in place, you know, you could have experiences that are completely gamified or like extremely engaging and get inputs from you in many different ways, and that gets translated to a formal expression. And that the formal part here is important, and that's what we have not been able to capture now. So with Vocdoni, what we've been doing is we understanding voting as a protocol, and now translate this to different instances. one is the governance platform that we're using, which will try to experiment with different ways of expression. You have like different ways of asking questions, like a Likert scale, or quadratic voting, or liquid democracy, or vote delegation. There is many different systems you can build on top that you can present in any interface you want. Like, this is really up to us to imagine. But unless we have like the primitive that allow that, it's really hard to articulate this, theatrical experience, this engaging experience that you, David, is describing.
Okay, I have to disagree on the last point, but maybe we've got one question that we can go through. But Skinner, you're looking extremely thoughtful.
Well, I'm listening and thinking about the. I mean, I don't disagree with what Chavi is saying. I mean, I think that the technical tools are very important to build, and it is important to have a wide variety of stakeholders involved. I think that it misses there's a gap here with what you were asking, David, which is that the actual engagement problem, because the engagement problem is as much about socioeconomic reality as it is anything else. So we have a wide variety of people who have no cognitive capacity after they've dealt with all the things they have to deal with to survive. They don't have any more capacity to engage with abstracted questions. They can barely deal with the concrete questions that they have to answer every day of their life with their families and their work and so on. And I think that this is one of the things that representative democracy was originally designed to address, is that, well, not everybody can be attending to all of the issues all of the time. But if we say, yes, but now our elites are out of touch and they don't represent us, well, then we're more or less left with what as a response? I mean, we could get all the coders involved. They all want to. They're actively engaged. But then, as you mentioned, David, this yields the problem of potentially creating a new priesthood of power, the same way that lawyers, financiers, and academics have been the priesthood of the Enlightenment power structure, and that the Catholic Church was the priesthood of the pre-Enlightenment structure. Well, we're now rapidly just moving from the previous academic financial elite into a technological elite, and I don't think that it solves the problem for the people who are in that current, but it doesn't solve the problem for democracy as a whole.
So do you have a suggestion of how to solve that? I'll read out actually the question that I have here, or try and paraphrase it, because it's along the same lines, right? So we're talking about this interface between people who do not have necessarily enough time or energy or educational background or whatever it is to engage, let's say, in the algorithm designed for voting, or just the time and effort needed to really get involved with the economic system and delve into it and so forth. I mean, a classic kind of fundamental democratic question. And the question from that's come in here on the chat, for some reason it's to me privately, is it here, if I can sort of read it out, is the major critique of direct e-democracy is its accessibility and challenge of populist agendas to lead in the public space. People are simply not necessarily civically educated enough to enter into politics. How do you think, and the real question at the end here is, how would you think new technology can educate citizens? How can that interface of bringing people on board come? And from my point of view, it's just, that makes my heart sing. It's just like there are so many easy, strong, fun, powerful ways to address that problem. I mean, one of them, the classic one in kind of political theory, which can be a bit dry, but it doesn't need to be very dry, are citizen assemblies. So if you take a random sample of people and you get them to discuss and you give them real access to information, and that tradition goes back to the ancient Greeks, right? But it's also the basis of our jury system, for fuck's sake. I mean, if we decide life and death matters just by taking 12 people or what have you, we can surely choose some decision about the budget on education schools in a similar sort of way. And that way you get this combination of a representative demos of the people and a chance to really provide in-depth information and discussion over months or years. So the Irish Citizen Assembly deliberative democracy experiment over the abortion law took a year. And there were, I can't remember how many local deliberations, 16 or something like that, that were facilitated with full access to the people. Now, that kind of theatrical setting of ordinary citizens coming together being facilitated could be done in all sorts of ways, at your local cinema, in a cafe, online, facilitated in a Zoom discussion, and you could bring it to life. And that way, you can provide a representative democratic sample the chance to deliberate at length. And you can also look at the data of that and see the quality of the decisions made compared with people just voting on Twitter or seeing a poster and putting a pebble in a box, right? So that is one really clear way to me, which is quite close to an educational process. People go through this long onboarding and they start off in one position and then they meet the policeman or they meet the prison guard or the teacher or the homeless person. And then they meet the psychologist and they spend months learning in this. And you take the deliberation of that group as your jury vote. Now, for me, a mixture of techniques like liquid democracy, which also incentivize effectively deliberation and bloggers, because the more kind of votes you get delegated to you, the more pat on the back you get for saying, I'll research that a bit more. I'll look into that bit more, right? So you get this dialogue, more of a bidirectional dialogue when you test it out. And citizen assemblies means that we can start to craft a way in which we engage people in a more impassioned way, which isn't technical. It isn't, it is much more political in terms of polis, in terms of human deliberation and passion. And in that process, we can bring art.
David, if I might, I agree with, I certainly agree with your sentiment. I think that actually getting from where we are to representative populations of people being willing to expend their time for free to engage in those issues, I think that there's quite a gap there. And
why would it be for free?
Well, one imagines that there's not resource to pay people for their engagement.
It's far, far cheaper than a normal democratic election. And by the way, you can just fund it through the media aspect if you want to. My overarching point, I mean, I think that this is, I think that will find its own challenge. But my deeper concern is, well, if we step back and look at the historic development of parliaments and of parliamentary procedure, they were originally designed to facilitate debate, fundamentally. The point was that the elected representatives, the people come and then they debate things openly and then they take a vote. The idea this, and I think that this derives from the honeymoon period of the Enlightenment. I mean, even the word parliament comes from the Latin root meaning to speak. And so I think it's certainly, vastly important that people do speak. The idea of debating, though, that we now have achieved at the grassroots level of society, which maybe a century ago was only in the economic middle class and upper classes, it has been an extension of this Enlightenment idea of objectivity that I'm not sure is something that we can still maintain at any kind of meaningful scale. And what I mean by that is, rather than debating issues, I think that one of the ways we're more likely to get people involved, real people, and not just people who like to debate, is if it's presented more as a form of like actual negotiation of interests.
because intellectual type people are very interested in debating. It's a pleasurable form of activity if you're a person of the mind that likes these sort of things. But I think that for most people in our democracies, this is not interesting to them. It's not entertaining to them, and in fact quite annoying to many people. And we have to grapple with that as being the reality of the substrate on which we're trying to implant these democratic ideas. But I do think that people become very passionate and engaged when it comes to negotiating their interests and figuring out, well, what can you live with? What can you not live with? And we don't ask these kind of questions. We ask them in these broad, abstracted, objective ways, like what's the best thing for everybody? And this is never going to get an answer to that question.
I think we've got about just 7 minutes left in our time. And I'd also like to give Savi a little bit of a...
I guess even less. Sorry for interrupting you. I guess even less.
Even less.
Probably 5 or less even.
I would just say one sentence. If we got hundreds of thousands of people turning out on the streets, if we got more people passionate about democracy and the greatest turnout in history and in the American election, I don't think there's any lack in willingness and passion to engage in things. And I don't think the debating format has got anything to do with what we're talking about here. I'm talking about rock and roll. I'm talking about video games. I'm talking about podcasting, music. I'm talking about making the process of politics and deliberation really, really entertaining and deep and emotional and meaningful. Savi.
I think what the elements missing here is like the disconnect. Why do we don't have the rock and roll that you're talking about? And I think there's many reasons, but one it is that I'm decoupled. Like I don't see that my actions as a citizens are having an effect in the real world. And why I don't see that, like I'm not gonna engage. What I want is like to be there. I want to be participant. Like how do we put that together? How do we like how do we join like the two extremes? And I think that's where we get the true engagement and the sensations that you, David, are talking about.
I agree totally. I mean, in our area, we used to have a phrase which is like, basically, I can't remember it exactly, but basically it says, I'm sick and tired of being consulted. People coming around and asking me and questioning me and surveying me. I want to decide. I want my vote to count. I just don't want my signal to be processed and maybe taken account of. To me, that is the visual feedback of my action having a relatively short and visible, like I can see that I helped activate that debate or that decision making, gave that more voice. And in liquid democracy, that's also what you get much more. You know, if I delegate to something, you can use that data for things like giving people increased airtime in a debate. You can do all sorts of things in which you get quite immediate feedback loops for my participation and engagement in the discussion. I don't know. Let's if I was to leave a last question with everyone here and basically say, if this is 1 hour discussion in the middle of a heated electoral contest, if you like, or democratic turbulence in Belarus, in America, and what have you, what would be the follow-on, the productive follow-on you would like? Because we clearly haven't reached an in-depth agreement. We've started a conversation, and just going to another conference a month later or doing something, that's not going to help, is it? Right. So from both your perspectives, what would you like in terms of support of your work, engagement with the situation here in Belarus, or as a follow-on from this conversation, what would you wish for? Savi.
For us, and like from the perspective of Vocdoni, we're building these tools, but as mentioned, like those need to be used. They need to be instantiated. So we're looking for organizations and people with ideas that really want to convert these tools in change society. We're coders, we're hackers, we're people that can do the technical part, but we don't know the context of the people, and each context is different and needs different solutions. So we want to understand them, we want to join them, we want to engage in this conversation. We want to do a macro hackathon for reimagining governance, and we just want to experiment. Like that's the thing, the stage we are. We need to experiment, we need to try.
And when will that hackathon be?
It's like I'll can forward it's open, but it's meant for like early next quarter, I think. Okay, I'll share it on the chat.
So in the spring, as we're coming out of coronavirus and as Belarus finally becomes independent, Skinner, what would you like? What support can people give your work? What would you like to engage in? Or how would you like to follow on?
Well, I don't have necessarily a specific request. I think that what I would like would be maybe a broader dialogue, and maybe this is something that the three of us could engage in another format, but a broader dialogue about what is a first step in a society, it doesn't really matter which one, of putting people post-coronavirus into the same room who believe that they hate each other. I think this is the first step to getting to any of the positive kinds of interactions that you were describing earlier, which I would love to see. I just think that first we have to figure out how people who hate each other can get over the fact that they hate each other enough to engage in that kind of dialogue productively.
So yes, I would like to see that as well. And with that, let's close. I wish and hope that we do continue this conversation.
As well.
And please forgive me if I got overly passionate, but I think
that was all great.
We have to. If we don't care, we wouldn't be here.
Okay, thank you.
Very clear. Thank you so much, guys.